favorite saints, Edith Stein, who whose name is at the Catholic dormitory in Vienna, where I used to live when I studied in Austria. And I went back a few years ago, and now it's named after her. And she was a convert. She had been an atheist, and then through study of philosophy became a Catholic and a Carmelite. And then because of her Jewish heritage, she was killed at Auschwitz by the Nazis. So here's a prayer from Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Oh my God, fill my soul with holy joy, courage, and strength to serve you. Enkindle your love in me, and then walk with me along the next stretch of road before me. I do not see very far ahead, but when I've arrived where the horizon now closes down, a new prospect will open before me, and I shall meet it with peace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Dr. Nussmeier, the floor is yours, my good friend.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to Father Brown. As we'll see in a few minutes, that it's the feast day of Edith Stein, and that we began with a prayer written by her is very, I think, auspicious, because I'll be discussing something related to her situation and related to Dante. So we'll see how that ties together. Thank you all for coming back again this evening. You're gluttons for punishment, coming back for a third time here. And I'll get started right away. I have another PowerPoint, and I will begin, as I said I would begin, and as I began last time, with a little bit of a recap of the first 2 weeks, just so we recall where we are in our discussion of Dante and saints and sinners in his Divine Comedy. So in week 1, we talked quite a bit about the context of the Divine Comedy, how and when Dante wrote it, what the political and sort of historical situation was in Italy at the time, and his role as an Italian poet, especially against the background of divided Italy, what we read in the Aeneid as fleeing Italy, always outside of our grasp. We also talked about how, quite incredibly, both liberal Italy, the nation state of Italy, and the church itself tried to claim Dante, as well as the idea that Italy's unification, perhaps the one thing uniting Italy when it was so fractured and factious, is its literature, especially Dante and others, that the church calls him ours, as we already said, that the vision presented in the Divine Comedy is one of a unified cosmos that ends with God himself, that we must read not just the Inferno, although the first couple lessons were concentrating on Inferno, but also Purgatory and Paradise, and we'll see why. And then finally, a quote from the 1965 Motu Proprio by Pope Paul VI about the inspiration for this course. Last week, we talked principally about the sort of formal structure of the Commedia, that each of the chapters is called a canto, that each of the 3 canticles, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, have 33 canti, although in the case of Inferno, there's a sort of prologue, and so it has 34. That Dante's rhyme is the terza rima, that is the second verse in every tercet, every 3-verse strophe or stanza provides the rhyme word for the first and third verses of the successive tercet. And this goes on for the entire Commedia. And that the meter he used was called the endecasyllable, which for the most part meant that there are 11 syllables in every verse, and that the final stress came on the 10th or the second to last syllable. We talked a little bit about the division and the circles, and even then the bolge, the sort of subcircles of Inferno, and we'll get to those a little bit tonight. I think I quoted T.S. Eliot in saying that there's no other poet who paid more attention to each individual word better than did Dante. And this is true even of the phonemes that make up words. So I didn't talk about this last week, but I want to introduce a few new things related to it. This is a passage from Inferno 3, about which we did say a few words last Tuesday. It's Inferno 3 is, of course, the sort of anti-Inferno, the pre-Inferno. And here we meet Caronte, the Infernal boatman, and he's kind of a wild-haired, white-haired old man with scary eyes. And we see how genius Dante is in the Italian on the left of your screen, how he's using very harsh consonant clusters. For example, in the first three verses here, verses 82, 83, 84, et ecco verso noi venir per nave un vecchio bianco per antico pelo, gridando guai a voi anime prave, and then tenebre eterne, per altre vie, altri porti, and so on. And so he has even the sounds that make up the individual words, the phonemes that make up these individual words, tend to reflect the content. And so here we have, again, the sort of pre-Inferno, we're about to go into the Inferno, and Dante's language reflects that. Whereas later on, and we'll find out about this next week when we read parts of Purgatory, in the very beginning of Purgatory, which one commentator, an early vernacular commentator, called just better than Inferno, because it is, this is the opening of Purgatory. Percorrer miglior acque, alze le vele, ormai la navicella del mio ingegno, che lascia dietro a sé mar sì crudele. So he evokes the sort of metaphor of the sea and the boat, and we're moving from the harsh language of Inferno to something more beautiful in Purgatory, more hopeful, as I said in the first lesson. And the
Professor,
consonants, yes.
you please share your screen?
Oh my gosh. I was so excited, I forgot to share my screen. Everybody will be so confused. So I'll go, I'll stay on this. Yeah, thank you very much for the reminder. I'll stay on this slide here. So here are the harsh consonants emphasized with the GR, the G, the PR, the BR, right? These gridando guai a voi anime prave. And here are the softer consonants of the beginning of Purgatory. In linguistics, these are actually called literally liquid consonants. And so there's a great sort of coming together of the name and the thing here as well. We're leaving behind the cruel sea of the Inferno and heading to the more hopeful waters, the better waters of Purgatory. And in order to emphasize this, the words Dante uses have these liquid consonants, especially this L, alze le vele, ormai la navicella del mio ingegno, and then bookended by the very end of Purgatory with still these same sort of liquid consonants. Io ritornai dalla santissima onda rifatto sì come piante novelle, rinovellate di novella fronda, puro e disposto a salire alle stelle. So you can see in the Italian that it's much softer, it's much more hopeful, it's much more beautiful, frankly. And this is what I was getting at when talking about how Dante tried to make the language he used match the facts that he was narrating within the poem. And there are two beautiful examples, one from Inferno and one from Purgatory, where he's doing exactly that. So now that we can see my slide here, we talked about Dante's attention to every word, every phoneme, talked a little bit about the vertical readings. And this is a really good way, if you don't have time to read all of the Divine Comedy, and sometimes we don't all have that ability, a really good way to get at the entire comedy by the parts is to read vertically and perhaps pick out the 6th canto of every canticle, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, and the 10th one and the 25th one, and so on. And it's a good way to at least get a feel initially for the Divine Comedy. And then we talked a little bit about the description of sinners and hell and Inferno. Exactly how does Dante describe these people here? And I'll jump ahead to that slide from last week. Ask for your patience. There we are. Eventually, we're going to get there. All right, and we are there. So hell is an eternal place. It's a loco eterno. Eternal in the sense that it will be never ending. And that there are desperate cries and despairing cries of ancient souls. They are sorrowful and unhappy, right? At the beginning of Inferno 3, it is the city of woe, the città dolente. Again, eternity and eternal, eterno dolore, perduta gente, those people who are lost, these souls who are lost, miserable sinners, wretched souls, souls that mercy and justice hold in contempt. These are all examples from Inferno 3, again, that anti-inferno where we meet Caronte, the infernal boatman, wretched, wicked souls, the anime prave, and again, eternal darkness. So this gives you a feel for how Dante describes and sets the scene for the question of sin in the Inferno. So going back to our brief resume of last week, after the description of sinners and hell in the Inferno, we introduced very briefly Inferno 1 and 2, the idea that Inferno 1 is a sort of prologue, and in Inferno 2, we finally have the invocation to the Muses, very typical of epic poems. In Inferno 1, Dante meets with Virgil. In Inferno 2, of course, Dante is kind of apprehensive, and Virgil calls him essentially a coward and says, look, you're going to be getting some help, both from me and this random woman who happens to be Beatrice, and you should take heart. You should have courage. And Dante does. But also in Inferno 2, he says, I'm not Paul, I am not Aeneas, right? So two people who are supposed to have made journeys to the depths, he is not either of them. Although it's a little bit of false humility because we know that he does take the journey anyway. In Inferno 3, I also mentioned briefly the neutrals, and we just saw some more passages from Inferno 3. And in Inferno 5, I talked at a little bit of length, although we were near the end, about Francesca and Paolo. So here in Inferno 5, which became, thanks to the Romantic poets, kind of the most famous in canto in all of the Divine Comedy. I mentioned that there are operas written about this canto. There are pieces by Rachmaninoff written about this canto. There were theatrical performances all over the world, especially in the 19th century, about this canto, Inferno 5. Even though, of course, for Dante, it was a somewhat negative example. We're in the second circle of hell. Francesca and Paolo are in-laws, and they're guilty of lust occasioned by reading, if you'll recall. They were reading about Guinevere and Lancelot, and they were then killed by Francesca's husband, Gianciotto, who will be waiting in the lowest circle of hell, Caina, which is reserved for those who kill family members. And one of the important things about Inferno 5, and we'll get back to this later on, probably in subsequent lessons, is that it demonstrates the importance of the necessity of reading beyond Inferno, because Dante the character, and perhaps Dante the poet, almost demonstrates a bit of understanding and almost shows approval of what Francesca and Paolo do, or at least he can sort of understand their position and the temptation of lust. He mentions time and again that he took pity on these sinners and that he was so overwhelmed that he fainted. But later on, we'll see, especially in Paradise, that this initial reaction will be revised, and again, demonstrating the importance of reading beyond the Inferno, which we will do. We actually have, in the first couple of canti of Inferno, and I mentioned in passing last week, the first two saints. Now, we hope that Dante did not put any saints in hell, but he did put popes, as we saw from Inferno 19 in the first lesson 2 weeks ago. But we have the first sort of oblique mentions of saints in hell, both of them in Inferno 2. I mentioned already when Dante says, Io non Enea non Paolo sono, I am not Aeneas, nor am I Paul. Then we have later on, in the same canto 2, Beatrice speaking to Virgil, and this is reported speech that is relayed to Dante. She, Mary, summoned Lucy and made this request. And I quote, "Your faithful one is now in need of you, and I commend him to your care." Lucy, the enemy of every cruelty, arose and came to where I, that is Beatrice, sat at venerable Rachel's side. So we have some of the first saints at least alluded to and mentioned obliquely, even in hell. Now, of course, we won't meet anymore because that would be problematic even for Dante, who again was willing to do some things, but to put saints in hell, I think not. And by the way, Lucy is another interesting choice, of course, for a lot of reasons, but one of the possible reasons he might have chosen Lucy here and associated her with Beatrice is because Beatrice's parish church was actually dedicated to Santa Lucia. And so there might be another reason, in addition to Lucy's own qualities, that he chose her to make this intercession with Beatrice, who would later on be his guide, beginning at the end of Purgatory, and about which we will talk next week. So that's a little bit of a recap so far of week 2. And again, we talked a lot about the structure of the Divine Comedy, form as the reflection of content, the use of the endecasyllable, terza rima, and so on. And introduce the first few canti, especially the second circle, Francesca Paolo, Semiramis, and so on. And I'll jump through these until we get to the good stuff for tonight. Talked also about Dante's distinction, and this happens time and again where people see him and they say, wait a minute, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to have a body. You're not supposed to have a physical substance. And already we get a preview of this when Caronte tells him, you're not coming here with these other people, right? You're going with another ship, right? And so that brings us to tonight. As I mentioned at the outset, it was extremely providential that Father Brown began the way he did, because I'm also somehow going to mention Auschwitz tonight and the Italian Jewish author Primo Levi, and try to connect him to Dante. So most of you may have heard of Primo Levi. Perhaps you read some of his work. His most famous work is the title that you have up above, which is Se questo è un uomo, and the image of which you also see on your screen. Unfortunately, the original English translation of this work translated the title as Survival at Auschwitz, which completely undermines the title in Italian. The title in Italian is the first half of a hypothetical clause, and it means, if this is man. And it's, of course, detailing his experience at Auschwitz. So the rest of it we could fill in with, if this is man, I don't want to see what an animal is, right? This sort of thing. So the title in Italian means, if this is a man, translated for the first few decades as Survival at Auschwitz. Primo Levi was an Italian who was, as he described himself, an assimilated Jew growing up in northern Italy, in Torino. He was a chemist by trade, but he had a great grounding in the humanities, and especially in classical literature. And this would come in handy. So we're not used to thinking about, at least most of us, thinking about the concentration camps in World War II in terms of Italian contributions, if we can call it that, to the atrocities and to the shipping of Jews and others to concentration camps. But after 1935, Italy became a little bit more racially oriented. And in 1935 was the pact with Hitler. And in 1938, Italy passed a series of laws called the racial laws, the leggi razziali, for which, and after which, many Jews were sent to what is called confino, and that's a sort of exile. They were sent to the south of Italy. They were sent to islands, remote islands, and about 10,000 Italian Jews eventually were deported to concentration camps and were killed at places like Bergen-Belsen, at places like Auschwitz. And that was probably about 20% of Italian Jews, something like that, because even today there are about 50,000 Jews in Italy. Well, what's significant about Primo Levi, even though he's a chemist, is that Se questo un uomo, his memoir, if you want to call it, of his time at Auschwitz, is shot through with reminiscences about Dante. And in fact, it's no exaggeration, and he says it, that Dante basically saved his life at the concentration camp at Auschwitz. This is perhaps actually not unusual, In the last 4 or 5 years, there have been titles written called How Dante Can Save Your Life and In a Dark Wood, for example. Rod Dreher, who's a journalist who actually used to live here in Dallas, wrote a book published in 2015 or 16 called How Dante Can Save Your Life, which was a great boon to us Dantisti and Italianists. If you're trying to get students to read a book and you say, look, it could save your life, they're a lot more interested in it. And then there's a beautiful memoir written by a colleague of mine at Bard College, whose name is Joseph Luzzi. And he wrote how Dante pulled him out of a deep spiral of grief after his 9-month pregnant wife was killed in a car accident, leaving him a widower and a first-time father because the baby survived. And he talks about how Dante, and reading Dante and reflecting on the situations in the Divine Comedy allowed him to at least heal in part. And so getting back to Primo Levi, perhaps the idea that Dante can save one's life is not all that unusual. I'd hate to call the Divine Comedy a self-help book. It would be much too reductive. But I think it does have that power, and great literature has that power, especially a literature and an epic poem that was both divinely and sort of earthly influenced, let's put it that way. So in Se Questo in Uomo, that is Survival at Auschwitz, or If This Is a Man, Primo Levi reflects on the role of the Divine Comedy. And not only that, but specifically, he begins to reflect on one canto of the Divine Comedy, a canto that he had put to memory. And that canto is Inferno 26, the canto that I had mentioned we would talk about this evening, the so-called Canto di Ulisse, the canto of Ulysses or Odysseus, the Homeric personage and hero. And in a later chapter of this memoir, he talks about how he wanted to teach Italian to a fellow prisoner whose nickname was Piccolo. His real name was Jean, from I think Alsace region or something like that. And he taught him Italian by way of reciting from memory Canto 26 and the Canto of Ulysses. Here you have a medieval, early 15th century image of on the screen of Dante and Virgil meeting the sinners of Canto 26. And then on the right-hand side of that image, Dante and Virgil meeting Ulysses and his partner in crime here in Inferno 26. So kind of an arresting image of the sinners who are turned into flames and encased in a flame to sort of parody their use of too much intellect and too much reason. So getting back to the question of Primo Levi and Dante, let's take a look at the next slide. I mentioned that this memoir, this beautiful book, and by the way, I would put Primo Levi's book up with any of the sort of what we could call Holocaust literature. So Elie Wiesel, Anne Frank, Viktor Frankl, any of these memoirs or novels or anything written about the experience at Auschwitz. Primo Levi's is the one that has touched me the most. And as I mentioned, it's shot through with the Divine Comedy. If we look at this first passage here that we have up on the screen, and I quote, this is from early on, I think chapter 2. The journey, that is the journey to Auschwitz, did not last more than 20 minutes. Then the lorry stopped and we saw a large door and above it a sign brightly illuminated. Its memory still strikes me in my dreams. Arbeit macht frei. Work gives freedom. We have a terrible thirst. This is hell. Today in our times, hell must be like this. And obviously, you can't help but think of Inferno 3 and Dante saying that there's the infernal gate, above which there's the inscription, Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Here too, we could forgive Primo Levi if he were to have abandoned all hope, entering his own sort of hell here in 1943. Here's another description of the situation at Auschwitz. The confusion of languages is a fundamental component of the manner of living here. One is surrounded by a perpetual Babel, in which everyone shouts orders and threats in languages never heard before, and woe betide whoever fails to grasp the meaning. No one has time here. No one has patience. No one listens to you. We latest arrivals instinctively collect in the corners against the walls, afraid of being beaten. And finally, before we make a comparison to our friend Dante. One cannot hear the music well from Kabe. The beating of the big drums and the cymbals reach us continuously and monotonously, but on this weft, the musical phrases weave a pattern only intermittently, according to the caprices of the wind. We all look at each other from our beds because we all feel that this music is infernal. And we have then on the right-hand side, again, a long passage from the very beginning of Inferno 3, part of which I've already quoted in the previous two lectures. But again, we have through me the way to the city of woe, through me the way to everlasting pain, through me the way among the lost, justice move my maker on high. And then a few verses later, above written, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. These words, dark in hue, I saw inscribed over an archway, just like Primo Levi saw a large door and above it a sign brightly illuminated, Arbit Macht Frei, right? And Dante goes on to say, here, a master might, for me, this meaning of these words or this situation is hard. And he, that is Virgil, is one who understood. Here you must banish all distrust. Here must all cowardice be slain. We have come to where I said you would see the miserable sinners who have lost the good of the intellect, that is the bene del intellecto. And after he'd put his hand on mine with a reassuring look that gave me comfort, he led me towards things unknown to man. And again, we go back to the Primo Levi. The confusion of languages is a fundamental component of the manner of living here. One is surrounded by a perpetual Babel in which everyone shouts orders and threats in languages never heard before. And now we have not known to man. Now sighs, loud wailing, lamentation resounded through the air, so that I too began to weep. Unfamiliar tongues, again, languages you've never heard before, horrendous accents, words of suffering, cries of rage, voices loud and faint, the sound of slapping hands, all these made a tumult, always whirling in that black and timeless air as sand is swirled in a whirlwind, right? And so in a beautiful way, but yet a very sad way, Primo Levi evokes the beginning of Inferno in a real hell on earth that is Auschwitz in his memoir, Sequestro in Uomo. So this provides us a great sort of jumping off point, as I said, because not only is it shot through with Dante, it becomes very explicitly Dantean later on. Part of what Primo Levi did to keep his sanity, he ended up as a chemist working in a laboratory at Auschwitz, and he had access to paper. And so he would commit thoughts to paper, and he would also recall Dante's poem and write things down. And so later on, what happens is he begins to want to teach Italian, as I said, to his friend Piccolo. But first, a couple of more instances of where he assimilates Inferno and Dante to the real life Inferno of Auschwitz. The lager was a great machine to reduce us to beasts. We must not become beasts. And this will relate directly to Inferno 26, about which more in a minute. We are only tired beasts. If Jean, his friend, is intelligent, he will understand. He will understand. Today, I feel capable of so much. It actually recalls Inferno 3 that we just saw, saying, when Dante says to Virgil, these words are so hard, Virgil responds as one who understood. And Primo Levi wants to put himself in a similar situation here. So when he finally begins later on, I think in chapter 10, to teach his friend Italian, he says, here, listen up, Piccolo. Open your ears and your mind. You have to understand for my sake. Again, this was really, his very survival was at stake, of course, at Auschwitz. We all know the numbers. We all know the horrors endured at Auschwitz. And it's beautiful as well, though, that for Primo Levi, the thing that kept him going was the thought, the memory of the Dante that he had studied as a schoolboy. Thank the Lord for poetry and for Saturday school in Italy. Even today, Italian school children use Saturday school to memorize poetry. And so Primo Levi committed to memory, especially Inferno 26. And the tercet that he cites directly in his memoir, think of your breed, for brutish ignorance your metal was not made. You were made men to follow after knowledge and excellence, end quote. This is actually a tercet from Inferno 26. And it's from the speech that Ulysses gives to his men before taking him westward out to explore the mondo senza gente, the world without people, the sort of unknown world. So Inferno 26, verses 118 through 120. In that same moment, when thinking about Dante, we read, as if I also was hearing it for the first time. This is Levi speaking. Like the blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God. For a moment, I forget who I am and where I am. So in this instance, the memory of Dante transports him spiritually, emotionally, even sort of metaphysically and physically, bringing him outside of Auschwitz. On the right-hand side of the screen, we're going to see the passage from which Levi was quoting in this moment. This is from Inferno 26. Considerate la vostra semenza, fatti non foste a vivere come bruti, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. Consider how your souls were sown. You were not made to live like brutes or beasts, but to follow virtue and knowledge, sort of pairing the translation that we have in the Levi translation on the left-hand side here. But so here we are. Primo Levi has chosen Inferno 26 to teach his friend John Italian, but also to alleviate his own condition of suffering. Consider how your souls were sown, that is made, your origins. You were not made to live like brutes or beasts, but to follow virtue and knowledge. We see on the left-hand side of the screen how time and again, Levi characterizes the situation at Auschwitz. That is, the situation at Auschwitz risks reducing them to nothing but beasts. And so you can see why he's attracted to this particular terzina, this particular tercet. Although I'm loath to criticize Primo Levi here, but he's actually misinterpreting the way that Dante is using Ulysses here, because Ulysses, again, in these three verses, he's speaking to his men and trying to urge them on to give them a sort of Newt Rockney win one for the Gipper speech so that they'll go with him and explore. But for Dante, Ulysses, Odysseus, is not a model to follow. Again, remember, we are in hell. And so we're going to consider Inferno 26 and think about how Dante depicts Ulysses, why Primo Levi might have chosen here to use Ulysses in his positive acceptation, and how we should read Inferno 26. So possibly many of you didn't have time to read this canto for tonight, but I urge you that if you have time, you should do so, because it's also, especially Ulysses' speech from verses 90 on, are one of the most gorgeous examples of Italian that you'll ever find. And it's, again, a great paradox that Ulysses is in hell. Ulysses is kind of an anti-model, but it's beautiful as well. So Dante opens this canto, and by the way, we're now in the eighth, we're going to the eighth bolgia, getting down to the bottom of the sort of third to last circle of hell here. But Dante can't let Florence go. You'll recall from the first lesson 2 weeks ago, I mentioned how Dante, everything he does is characterized and given impetus by his exile from Florence. So even though we're far away now, in Inferno 26, he opens with an apostrophe, an invective against Florence, saying that Florence's name resounds for the halls of hell, and that everyone knows about Florence and hell. And this is what he does in Inferno 6, and Inferno 10, and Inferno 15, and here in Inferno 26, and later on in Inferno 33. He can't let Florence go. But throughout, in this canto, as in other places, it's a great weaving operation, a great mosaic of the political, the contemporary, the ancient, the religious, the secular, the Latin, the vernacular, the mythical and mythological, and the historical. So we saw in Inferno 5 last week that the exemplary sinners of that canto, of this second circle, the sin of lust, are real people who lived, Francesca and Paolo. In this canto, it is Ulysses / Odysseus, who is a literary mythological figure. There are about 500 people named in the Divine Comedy. About half were mythological or literary, and about half were real historical personages who lived. And so Dante is going back and forth with his exemplary sinners, sometimes from literature, sometimes from antiquity, sometimes from mythology, sometimes from contemporary Italy. And so here we have Ulysses and Odysseus, as I said. We're in this moving from the seventh pouch, the seventh bolgia, to the eighth, which is often characterized as the one for which we have the sin of fraudulent rhetoric. So the question here is Ulysses guilty of fraud? And if so, of what sort of fraud? Is it fraud related to speech and to rhetoric? Is it a sort of different type of fraud? And in considering this, these are some of the things of which he is accused by the criticism and by commentators: fraudulent advice or rhetoric, shrewdness, sort of astuteness, or fraud in the course of conducting a war. Because the question is, how is Ulysses's fraud different from the fraud that comes later? Because there's a lot of fraud in this area of the Divine Comedy and in this area of hell. And so a few recent commentators have alighted on the idea that Ulysses's fraud here is related to the conduct of war. And we'll see in a moment why that might be the case. But other questions raised are fraudulent rhetoric, false humility, going beyond human limits, and even Ulysses, Odysseus, as a serpent-like tempter of men, a la the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Ulysses says to his men later on, when he's giving them this speech to sort of rally the troops, forget about the time you have left as men on earth. You know, this is how we can make ourselves immortal. Let's go, right? Let's go. So I wanted to begin sort of at the beginning. After the apostrophe, the invective against Florence, Dante, the poet, takes us back to his memory of what he saw in this circle, this bolgia of hell. And he says, and I quote, "Allor mi dolsi, e ora mi ridoglio." So this is very important about the freshness and the sort of continuity of this memory that Dante has. "I grieved then, and now I grieve again. As my thoughts turn to what I saw," that is Ulysses, "and more than is my way, I curb my powers, lest they run on where virtue fails to guide them, so that a friendly star or something better still has granted me its boon, its gifts. I don't misuse that gift." So this is a clue, at least a partial clue, to the placement, the meaning of the placement of Ulysses in hell. Perhaps he has used his gift of intellect in a fraudulent manner, or has misused his gift of intellect. And so Dante, the poet, says, this is a really good reminder, as I think again, and as I grieve again about what I saw, to not make that same mistake myself. So Dante has already seen this, and now Dante, the poet, is reflecting on what Dante, the character, saw earlier when he made the trip to hell. So the question is, how does Ulysses misuse the gift of the intellect, which is a gift that separates men from animals? In Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia, he talks in a very Aristotelian way about how that which separates men from animals is, number one, the ability to speak, and number two, our ability to use reason, which are linked. So, possible sins for which, or of which Ulysses is guilty: misuse of the intellect, misuse of prudence and discretion. Perhaps the thinking about that the intellect has absolute superiority over the body. And I mentioned this already, when he gives a speech to his men to say, hey, let's go, he's thinking only about the intellect. And this is sort of the opposite of what we saw in Inferno 5. I think it was Mr. Joe Donahue who brought up that one of the important features of Inferno 5 and the sin of lust, according to Dante, is that these sinners are those who subordinate reason to desire. In this case, everything else has been subordinated to the intellect, that is, to reason. So it's kind of the opposite of what we saw in Inferno 5. That is, he de-emphasizes the corporeality of his men and assimilates them almost to angels. So angelic intelligences, according to Dante, have only that need. They don't have a bodily need as men do. So he was almost elevating men to the level of the angels. There's also, perhaps, in addition to misuse of the intellect, misuse of prudentia, the distorted use of language, that is misuse of rhetoric. A play on words is really important here. In Italian, the word lingua means both language and tongue. And so the punishment of sinners here is to be encased in a flame. And the flames are flickering, kind of like a tongue of fire, right? We've all seen how flames can look like a forked sort of tongue. And so there's perhaps a play on words here that Ulysses and his ilk are guilty of sins of the tongue, thinking maybe back to even St. James, perhaps. One other thing to consider with Ulysses is that he has transgressed limits that are both human and divine. That he takes his men out towards the Colonna di Ercole, the Pillars of Hercules, through the Strait of Gibraltar, which during the time of the Roman Empire marked the extreme boundaries, the sort of outer bounds of what humans knew of the known world, let's say. So these are all things to think about with Ulysses in Canto 26. But it changes a little bit, or at least our understanding of of Ulysses and his possible sins changes a bit when we actually read the text. So reading a few verses on, that is verses 58 through 63, we see a listing by Dante of the sins of which Ulysses is guilty. These are relayed by Virgil, of course. And I quote, "In their flame, they mourn the stratagem of the horse that made a gateway. We've all heard of the Trojan horse, through which the noble seed of Rome came forth. There they lament the wiles for which in death Deidamia mourns Achilles still, and there they make amends for the Palladium." So here, Ulysses is accused of three things related to fraud. Accused of perpetrating the fraud of the Trojan horse in order to enter into the city. He's accused of tricking Achilles into fighting against Troy. That's why his wife is mourning Achilles still in verse 62. And also stealing the wooden statue, the sort of sacred art in Troy, the Palladium, and bringing it eventually, or having it brought eventually to what would become Rome. And so these are the specific sins of which he is accused. So keeping that in mind, I think it's important to consider, as I said, verses 90 until basically the end of the canto, that is verse 143 or so. And it's probably worth looking at mostly in a whole, this passage. This is Odysseus, Ulysses himself, speaking to Virgil and Dante. And I quote from verse 90, "When I took leave of Circe, who for a year and more beguiled me there, not far from Gaeta, before Aeneas gave that name to it, not tenderness for a son, nor filial duty toward my aged father, nor the love I owed Penelope that would have made her glad, could overcome the fervor that was mine to gain experience of the world and learn about man's vices and his worth." So one other charge that's been leveled against Ulysses, or at least Dante's Ulysses here, is that he also sort of abandoned his family, or at least he didn't give them due thought that he should have. And he continues, "And so I set forth on the open deep with but a single ship and that handful of shipmates who had not deserted me. One shore and the other I saw as far as Spain, Morocco, the island of Sardinia, and other islands set into that sea. I and my shipmates had grown old and slow by the time we reached the narrow strait where Hercules marked off the limits." And again, we have here then the Pillars of Hercules, "warning all men to go no farther." So again, Ulysses is conscious that these have been the outer limits. I would also stop to mention here, one important thing for getting sort of the vibe of Dante is to understand how far the pre-modern conception of this sort of thing, ideologically speaking, is from our own. So if you think about it in the pre-modern conception, and I was reading a great essay on this canto just this morning that emphasized this. In the pre-modern era, it was transgressive to go beyond the limits, right? It was normal to have limits, whereas in our modern era, it's transgressive to have limits rather than to transgress those limits. And so this during Dante's time, and it would have been so even earlier during Ulysses' time, was considered something kind of outre, something transgressive to go beyond those confines that marked off the limits, warning all men to go no farther. He continues, on the right-hand side, I left Seville behind. On the other, I left Ceuta. "O brothers," I said to his shipmates, who in the course of 100,000 perils at last have reached the West to such brief wakefulness of our senses as remains to us, do not deny yourselves the chance to know, following the sun, the world where no one lives. And this is again where he's accused of throwing aside everything but this intellectual desire to know that which has not been known, right? And then we come to the passage that we already cited and that Primo Levi cited. He continues to his men in order to, again, rally them. Consider how your souls were sown. You were not made to live like brutes or beasts, but to pursue virtue and knowledge. With this brief speech, I had my companions so ardent for the journey, I could scarce have held them back. And having set our stern to sunrise, in our mad flight, we turned our oars to wings, always gaining on the left. Now night was gazing on the stars that light the other pole, the stars of our own so low they did not rise above the ocean floor. 5 times, that is for 5 months, the light beneath the moon had been rekindled and has often been put out since we began our voyage on the deep. When we could see a mountain, distant, dark, and dim, in my sight, it seemed higher than any I had ever seen. We rejoiced, but joy soon turned to grief, for from that unknown land there came a whirlwind that struck the ship head on. 3 times it turned her and all the waters with her. At the 4th, our stern reared up, the prow went down, as pleased another, until the sea closed over us. End quote, and end of Canto 26. So Canto 26 ends with this long speech reported to Virgil by Ulysses himself here in the 8th Bolgia, the 26th canto of the Inferno, here where he is encased in flame, a flame that represents the light of reason, probably, and the abuse of the light of reason, the abuse of the intellect, of which he is accused here. I think we're already coming up on only a few minutes left. So I wanted to say just a couple of other things about this canto, and perhaps we'll leave aside the final couple canti of Inferno and the question of Count Ugolino and his sons, although if we have a minute, I may say something. One thing to keep in mind here, and it's remarkable, is that this is truly Dante's Ulysses, Dante's Odysseus. There was no knowledge of the Greek here. Italians would not have access to the Greek, Homer in the Greek, until the middle of the 15th century, until after 1435 and then 1453, when there was an exchange from the East to the West finally again, and Italians again were able to read and learn Greek. So Dante had, if he had access to Homer, it was in Latin translation, and even at that was a partial Latin translation, perhaps. So there were medieval vernacular versions of the Odyssey and of Odysseus, Ulysses circulating during Dante's time. And so those may have heavily influenced his depiction of Ulysses here. But again, what remains and what I want to ask everyone tonight is, how are we to take Ulysses here? And should we have the sympathy for Ulysses that Primo Levi seems to have when he teaches his friend Piccolo Italian by reciting from memory Canto 26. These verses that we have up on screen, verses 118 to 120, consider how your souls were sown. You were not made to live like brutes or beasts, but to pursue virtue and knowledge, become for Primo Levi the sort of sine qua non, the thing without which he could not live in Auschwitz. And so they gave him this great hope. He didn't want to live like a brute or a beast. But of course, here in Dante, Ulysses' piccola orazione, his small discourse, his very brief speech, is not necessarily to be taken as a model or as an example. So this has been interpreted positively, like Infernal 5, by many romantics and Tennyson and other poets who have considered this canto, and Primo Levi, as we've just heard. But the question is, for us is, are we to take Ulysses as a sort of role model here, or should we consider him a sinner, as Dante does, and someone who frankly should not be followed, as unfortunately his unfortunate shipmates decided to do in going to the West with him? So these are some questions we can reflect on. And as I said, we're only about 5 minutes to 10. So perhaps we'll stop here and consider if you have questions and talk a little bit about what we said tonight, either the sort of recap of the first 2 weeks, questions that you had left over, or questions about Primo Levi and about Dante, Ulysses, and Canto 26.
Very good. Thank you. It looks like we
Thank
already
you.
have one question. Joe Donahoe, let me make it so everybody can unmute themselves. Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that Dante just pretty much invents that stuff about Ulysses or Odysseus, right? Because
Yes.
the Odyssey has a happy ending for Odysseus. He just settles
Yeah.
down with his wife and makes his peace with Poseidon.
Yeah.
And I think, one thing to understand about the difference between Odysseus and Ulysses is that, looking from a Christian perspective, Ulysses is deceptive with the Trojan horse, and he does a lot of things that are not moral, but he does it in a world where there isn't really that much morality, including the gods aren't moral.
So I mean, the question is, Dante perhaps then could have put him in limbo with Virgil, right? If he's thinking that his deception related to war is prudent or just, right?
Yeah, I interviewed a psychiatrist about Odysseus, and he thought Odysseus was like a leap forward from the characters in the Iliad.
Yeah.
Because the characters in the Iliad are just pretty much driven by force, by fate.
Yeah.
Whereas Odysseus is always restraining himself throughout both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and coming up with ideas and jumping around the other things that people fall victim to.
Yeah.
And the Greeks called him polymeletos, man of many schemes. And he was the first creative mind. So, and I think there's a very big difference between, the pagan Greek thinking and the medieval Christian thinking that you would see with Dante.
Absolutely.
And the Greeks admired Odysseus because he was intelligent. They valued that more than almost anything else, just ability to be creatively intelligent.
Yeah.
Whereas Dante is very much, well, you have to know the rules and follow them.
Absolutely. And as I said, Dante does not have access to the Greek here, and he essentially invents almost whole cloth with influence from contemporary vernacular accounts of Ulysses that also are not much rooted in the Greek. So our Ulysses here is certainly different from the Greek Odysseus. Yeah. And I think Susan has a question too. Thank you, Joe.
Unmute yourself, Susan.
I keep forgetting I have to go to the bottom first. Okay.
That's all right. I forgot to share my screen tonight, so we're all
I know, hey, we're kind of
technologically deficient tonight.
equally sinners.
Yeah.
I'm noticing that, I mean, I haven't read a lot of the Iliad and the Odyssey parts of it. I was very much into Aristotle, though, and I hadn't read Dante before this class. But I have noticed, and it slapped you upside the head. I mean, obviously Dante is appealing for the Christian point of view, the Catholic point of view, whereas the Greeks were pagans. But you can admire Ulysses for what he did. They would have stayed nowhere if they'd followed just what Dante thought about being bold and all that. At the same time, though, Dante had a sense of the divine and the religious, whereas, of course, Ulysses didn't. He had his own morals, but I see there's a conflict right there where you'd be calling him a sinner, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there were pagans that Dante admired, right? Virgil first among them, right? As he's the virtuous pagan who came down from limbo, or up from limbo and then back down with Dante, or Statius later on, right, in Purgatory. Dante admires pagans, and in this case, he's very restrained with respect to any admiration for his Ulysses. Again, I keep emphasizing that this is truly Dante's Ulisse, right? This is Ulysses found in hardly any other accounts, and certainly not the Homeric account, right? But he serves a great purpose for Dante. As I said, he has an inordinate sort of elevation of the intellect above all others. And so for Dante, this is something that he himself perhaps is prone to. You remember I quoted 19 through 24 at the beginning of the canto, where Dante says, you know, I grieved and I grieve again, and I try not to, if I'm ever gifted with this thing, this power of intellect, the gift of intellect, I aim not to misuse it.
He has many more mea culpas than Ulysses would ever do.
Yeah. I mean, Dante goes back and forth beside the sort of like false humility and true humility, and he's certainly guilty of pride at certain points of the Commedia, but I do think he was sincere in trying to not follow his Ulysses as an exemplar here. Well, thank you, Susan. Yeah.
Well, sure.
Marlena Hinkle, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. So I have a question kind of similar to what you were just talking about with Susan. You know, I think we see that Dante really kind of embodies Ulysses in a way, because right, Ulysses is going to the place where there are no people, and then Dante is doing the same. And I think, you know, even just like a few cantos later in Purgatory 1, when he enters those, he says here, like that in the English, then I turned to the right, setting my mind upon the other pole, and saw 4 stars not seen before except by the first people, which is really reminiscent of that last bit that we just read in Canto 26. So I was curious what your thoughts were.
Yeah. So I think that's a great point that you bring up in Purgatory 1. And as I mentioned quite a few times, Dante is continually looking ahead throughout the entire Commedia. There's a remarkable sort of underlying and intricate architecture. And if you notice, obviously Inferno 26 is heavy on the talk of ships and traveling, and also flying, turning oars into wings, and so on. In Purgatory 1, it's no coincidence that Purgatory 1 opens with another metaphor involving a boat, right? And waters. So Dante is a sort of, just like he's almost a new Paul or a new Aeneas, he's also almost a sort of new, more restrained Christian Ulysses. And we see that these are not by accident, that Dante is recalling situations from earlier on in the Inferno and sort of refitting them for purgatory. There's no doubt. He also uses, expressions like the nave del mio ingegno, the ship of my intellect and my genius, which relates directly to those things that we just read about in Canto 26 when he talks about the ingegno of Ulysses, I think at verse 20 or 21. And so to point that out is a perfect example how Dante is revising what we've seen in Inferno. And this we didn't really get to yet for tonight, but I wanted to get to the final canti of Inferno and the absolutely horrific situation of Conte Ugolino, who is forced to eat his own children. Even there later on, we have this in Inferno 33, we have the perversion of the Eucharist, right? And that is corrected later on in Purgatory. So Dante is always giving us something in Inferno that is then sort of recontextualized, redimensioned later on in Purgatory, just as you mentioned, Marlena, with the example of seeing something that no other human had ever seen, just as Ulysses urged his men to go on to the mondo senza gente, the world without people, that is beyond which anyone else had ever seen, beyond the borders of the Roman Empire even. So yeah, really did well to point that out. And I agree completely that it's important to always be looking forward and backward when reading Dante.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting that he even uses that same phrase, l'altro polo.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you look, and that's the importance of really having a side-by-side Italian English edition of the book, because some of these things do not come out in translation very well, and you can see the extraordinary attention that Dante pays to individual words, and the extraordinary valence of words that are used in Inferno and then used again in Purgatory or Paradise. I mentioned earlier about Inferno 5 and how Dante will revisit the situation of Inferno 5 and Paradise, and that's because he uses the same words to describe the love, the sort of profane love that Francesca and Paolo have, and the sacred love that Dante character, has for God later on in Paradise. Same vocabulary. And so Dante is really, really intent on making us read him closely and understand how we're in a different situation, a different realm entirely when we're moving to Purgatory and Paradise.
Great, thank you. Christopher Nantista, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I was just thinking if Dante judged that Ulysses merited hell for transgressing the limits in search of knowledge and leading his crew through the Pillars of Hercules and on to their doom. I think it's fortunate that that's not a moral lesson that was absorbed by another Italian a century or two later named Christopher Columbus, who went through the Straits of Gibraltar and sailed on to actually find something.
That's funny because there are actually some commentators and critics who have pointed out the similarities between Cristoforo Colombo and Ulysses here in Canto 26. In fact, I was just reading something else today that talked about that exact situation. So yeah, I mean, it's I think there are a lot of things at play here in Canto 26, and it's not simply his transgression of the boundaries. I do think that is important, but as I said in verses 58 through 60, we do have essentially enumerated list of his sins, right? Which are related sins, perhaps sins of the intellect, related to prudencia, to prudence in the conduct of a war. But I don't think we can discount the fact that his final journey is also part of his sinfulness in Canto 26.
Very good. Do we have any other questions? I know Mary Rudolph had a question. Mary, would you like to ask your question? Or do you want me to go ahead?
It was just the translation. We could get a hard copy. I see that there are 3 links. And I'm a hard copy person. So my copy is a different one. So when I'm not following you correctly. I figure you probably have the
Yeah,
best
which
translation.
which translation are you reading?
What am I reading? Ciardi.
Yeah, I mean
John-
that's not awful, but I wouldn't. It's not one of my preferred translations. So the one I'm using right now is the Hollander.
Okay.
And that's there's also, I mean, there's the link to it, but I too am a hard copy person. That's why I have this in front of me right now.
That's what I figured.
I am tactile, and I mean, look, part of my research is into like material philology. So I look at manuscripts, I look at early printed books and things like that. So I have to have my hands on actual physical books and containers of things. So I totally understand.
Amen.
Yeah, but so I will usually use the Hollander for the translations here. Now, most of the translations use the same base text by Petrocchi from 1967. Anything like post 1967 will use the Petrocchi base text for the Italian. Although then the English translations will be different, but the Italian should be the same in the Ciardi as it is in the Mandelbaum, as it is in the Esselin, as it is in the Hollander, as it is in the Durling Martinez, and so on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Now, Susan Hart, you have another question?
Just one short question. In reading, I think it was 34 of Inferno, it seems to me that Dante is fairly influenced by Revelation. It's very phantasmagoric, very much like Revelation is, with the 7 heads and all of this.
Wait till you get to paradise. At the end, yeah.
Much to await me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's Dante has a lot of influences, and many of them are scriptural. Many of them, though, are also sort of fantastical mashups of different things. He was not necessarily apocalyptic, I would say, but there was an apocalyptic strain in Italian literature and in Italian society. Joachim de Fiori and people like that, more or less contemporaries or just before Dante. So absolutely, yeah. In Inferno 34, there's certainly a strong tenor there. A revelatory tenor.
All right, very good. Any more questions or statements? Marlena Hinkle, you have another question?
Yeah, hi. I guess no one else had a question.
Hello again.
So I'm curious about the imagery of the Pillars of Hercules. Like,
yeah.
I wrote I double majored in Italian in undergrad, and I wrote my thesis on Gerusalemme Liberata, and
nice.
The frontispiece has the Pillars of Hercules with the ship sailing through, and it's kind of become an image of the boat of the book, like sailing through the uncharted seas as it is published and going through the world. And so I was curious if this was like a metaphor analogy that existed before Dante's time, or it really came about like because of Inferno Canto 26.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt this predates Dante. I would also say that he gave a sort of another impetus to it, another spark, but obviously these are the nautical metaphors. If you look at even like Ernst Curtius's work earlier in the last century, are legion throughout, whether it's scripture, whether it's Latin literature, whether it's just about anything. But I think in Dante, what's different in Dante is that it's very considered and it's consistent throughout, as we just saw, not just at the end of Inferno and Inferno 26, but also at the beginning of Purgatory, and then even later on. So the sort of marine or nautical metaphors, and the relationship to knowledge, I think are not something specifically Dantean, but Dante, like everything else, he kind of just does it better than everybody, right? Dante's not, as we know, the first Italian poet. He just does it better than everybody else. I think I made the analogy in my 100 Days of Dante lecture that he's like the Steve Jobs of epic poetry in the vernacular. Like Steve Jobs doesn't invent the computer. He just packaged it better than everybody else and sold it better than everybody else. And that's kind of I think that's actually insulting Dante a little bit with my analogy, but Dante does it better than everybody else. And so that also could be, the same could be said for his, the use of metaphors and the idea of ships and water. You know, he also, one thing about Inferno, and as you read Inferno, it's the most concretely sort of terrestrial of the three canticles. It's because I think of our propensity to sin as human beings on earth. It's the most earthly canticle, the one most tied to the geography of earth. And so if you look at like Inferno 21, it opens with the shipyards in Venice, and really concrete examples from Dante's time of shipbuilding and things related to the sea. So Dante was very much taken, even if he, you know, didn't probably know much of the sea and was probably, I don't know, never on a ship, you know, by this idea. I would mention one other thing. It's funny, a colleague and friend of mine who's at Villanova, and if you're interested in Italian things, one of the best podcasts around is called Italian Innovators, by Dr. Luca Cottini of Villanova University. And he actually introduced a recent episode of his Italian Innovators podcast by connecting Dante to Carlo Riva, who is the maker of luxury boats and yachts in northern Italy, and talking about a long-standing Italian fascination with the sea and these sort of metaphors related to both culture and literature. So, but that's just a plug for Italian Innovators as well, if you're looking for more Italian content.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I think we are having a little chat discussion.
Yeah, about Beatrice, maybe there was a question I saw pop up.
Yeah.
So she was not a saint. So Beatrice is, well, I mean, we don't really know everything about her. Most of what we know comes from Dante himself, not in the Commedia, but in the Vita Nova. So one thing, when people are introduced to Dante, they think, oh, the Divine Comedy, but Dante was actually the author of a number of other works, including some works that I've already mentioned, the Convivio, which is considered as sort of philosophical treatise, the De Vulgare Eloquentia, which is a Latin prose treatise on the eloquence of the vernacular. He was the author of random sort of just one-off poems, but also the author of the Vita Nova, which is really his only other real integral work. And it's a beautiful work. And in it, he recounts how he first met Beatrice and how they first caught each other's sort of glances. He met her when he was 9 years old. And obviously there's a lot of numerological significance, 3 times 3, 9 years old, these sorts of things. But they would see each other in church. They would see each other in the streets, and he would try to pretend he wasn't looking at her. And so Beatrice was just a regular young woman in Florence, from a family that was fairly well off, but was not Dante's wife or anything of the sort. And in fact, Dante was happily married, we think, although he didn't see his wife much after he was exiled, probably. But yeah, Beatrice was not a saint. And so, you know, her inclusion with Mary and with St. Lucy is something that kind of piques one's interest early on, but she was not a saint.
Very good. Thank you. Any more questions?
I think Bill had a question. Bill, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have to admit my ignorance, but because this is both my first introduction to Dante, and also I have more of an engineering background, so my literal background is really weak. But I've run across a translation by Reverend H.F. Carey that I find is almost unintelligible.
That's the 1885, yeah.
Yes.
Hold on 1 second.
He probably has a copy.
You intrigued Dr. Nussmeier's interest, Bill.
That's what I was
Oh.
exploring.
So I just came into something here. I'm gonna unwrap it.
Oh, boy.
This is the 1885 first edition of Carey's translation.
Oh, wonderful. Because the illustrations are just amazing.
Yeah, they're the Doré illustrations, right?
Yes.
And there are about 75 of them, I think. But it's a beautiful book. I actually have to get it rebound. You see how it's
Uh-huh.
the binding
Well,
needs to be fixed, but it should be an easy fix. I have to take it to the book doctor, but anyway, yeah. So you were saying the Carey translation, yeah, it's not that readable to modern ears, yeah.
But nevertheless, it has a tone. I wonder if you could compare that to the Italian, and a spirit that you can't get from something that's more plainly understood.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah,
a
that's
wonderful art to reading it that I
yeah.
very much appreciate. I'll let you comment.
Yes, what you're saying about the Carey translation strikes me as a similar impression to I had reading another translation that I believe I mentioned the first week by Clive James, which is fairly recent. It's from 2014 or 15, something like that. And I said the same thing about that translation that you just said about the Carey, that it might not be that accurate, perhaps, or readable word for word, but it captures somehow the spirit of the Italian better than others. The Clive James, what he did that was sort of revolutionary, he did not translate it in tercets, that is in the 3-verse stanzas. He actually used quatrains, which is completely different than what Dante did, but he said, well, I'm translating it into English, and quatrains are a sort of rhyme that works a lot better in English than tercets do, than terzine do. And so what you're saying about the Carey strikes me as very similar to what I've thought about this Clive James translation into the quatrains from 2014.
Well, I'm enjoying it very much. I'm enjoying the class also. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question and comment. It allowed me to show my first edition that I just came into. I have to take it to the book doctor. But I'm really excited about it. It's a beautiful book, as you said, and the Doré illustrations really add to it. And
Can you
I
show
actually
us
found,
one?
yeah, absolutely. Hopefully it won't fall apart. If not, I can just show you on an image on the internet. But
they're also online.
Yeah. So here's actually Canto 3.
Got the Gutenberg Press, and you can download the whole.
Yeah. I'll show this to you without. Okay, please don't rip. Okay.
No, that's okay. We don't want it to rip, Dr. Nussmeier. That's okay.
Yeah, I probably.
I think
probably
Christopher is showing us one, I believe.
Yeah, and I can.
Yeah.
If you look.
Christopher,
online.
you want to put it on the camera again?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
I have this beautifully bound hardcover Charty edition. It also has all the story illustrations in the public domain. You're saying?
Yeah. So yeah, these are. I mean, they're gorgeous and they're very well known, and they're about 70 or 75 in this Carey translation. I'm trying to call one up here that I can actually share, but that's okay. It's my internet is being a bit wonky here.
That's okay.
It's coming, patience.
Would you like to tell us what we need to read for next week while you pull that up?
Absolutely. I actually included them on the PowerPoint this time. So I'll project them, or I'll project the PowerPoint again here in one moment. And so I think we're going to try to get into Purgatory mean, obviously we want to get to paradise eventually, but so I think we'll do at least one lesson on purgatory next week. And I have a link in the slide here. If you're interested, there should be an S on the end of Jacques Le Goff's name, but his book from 1984, The Birth of Purgatory, retraces the idea of purgatory in art and literature in Europe. And he has a chapter on the Divine Comedy, the poetic triumph, the Divine Comedy, pages 334 to 355. And I actually have a link to the PDF if you don't have the hard copy of the book. And then I think you can take a look at Purgatory 1, 9, and 30 through 33 for next week.
Very good.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions?
The Doré is finally up here, so I'll share that just to give everyone a flavor.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
But yeah, you can and if you go to the website at Dorothy Parker's website, I believe at the University of Virginia, she's got a repository of images that are really excellent as well. So it seems like my internet's really not working, so we'll just quit trying.
That's okay. If you just give me the links,
screen.
I can share the links with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Any other questions for Dr. Nussmeier in the chat or otherwise? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Parlate ora o tacete per sempre.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Nussmeier, again for this wonderful presentation, and thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to conclude with a prayer from the Liturgy of the Hour today for Saint Teresa of Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein. So let us pray. God of our fathers, who brought the martyr Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross to know your crucified Son and to imitate him even until death, grant through her intercession that the whole human race may acknowledge Christ as its Savior, and through him come to behold you for eternity, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Again, thank you so much for coming, and I really appreciate it. Dr. Nussmeier, you are definitely full of knowledge and wealth and a walking encyclopedia in this, and I really appreciate all your efforts and all your help and enlightening us on this beautiful
topic. It's
topic.
my pleasure. Thank you, Deacon and Mary Molly, for helping to organize everything, and thank you all for coming back for a third bite this evening. We'll see you next week.
And we'll see you next week. God bless and have a great and blessed week.